Buenas tardes. La Secretaría de Cultura y el Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes y Literatura les dan la más cordial bienvenida a este espacio virtual, el Centro de Creación Literaria Javier Villaurrutia, sede de la Coordinación Nacional de Literatura de Bellas Artes, donde presentamos el libro titulado In the Margins, al margen, del traductor y escritor Robert Kramer. Robert Kramer nació en la ciudad de Nueva York, es dramaturgo, poeta, crítico y traductor de literatura europea. Ha publicado numerosos ensayos, artículos y libros sobre la historia de la literatura y las artes. Sirvió en el ejército de los Estados Unidos y estudió en varias universidades de los Estados Unidos y Europa. Fue profesor en el área de Historia Cultural Europea en la Universidad Xavier de New Orleans y después regresó a Nueva York para enseñar literatura alemana, literatura mundial e historia del arte en el Manhattan College de Riverdale, donde se desempeñó como director de estudios internacionales. Ha sido también profesor invitado en la Universidad de Connecticut, la Universidad de Syracuse y el Colegio Haverford, y ha dado conferencias en el Smithsonian, en el Museo Whitney de Arte Americano y en la Asociación de Terapeutas del Arte. Ha recibido 6 premios del National Endowment for the Humanities y ha sido becario Fulbright en Múnich, Alemania, así como becario del gobierno suizo en Berna. Ha dado lecturas de su poesía y sus traducciones en radio y televisión, así como en varias universidades, la Universidad de Nueva York, la Universidad de California y la Universidad de Harvard, y ha sido nominado para el premio Pushcart en los campos de poesía y crítica. Fue ganador del Concurso Nacional de Poesía Absolus 2016 y actualmente es vicepresidente de la Sociedad Browning de Nueva York. Bienvenido, Robert. Por la naturaleza de In the Margins, un libro escrito en idioma inglés, esta conversación será llevada a cabo en ese idioma entre el autor y el editor de Darklight Publishing, Roberto Mendoza Ayala, de quien me permito leer una semblanza. Roberto Mendoza Ayala nació en México y es residente de la ciudad de Nueva York desde el 2012. Es maestro en artes visuales por la UNAM. En el 94, como miembro del grupo Nautilium, obtuvo la beca FONCA del gobierno mexicano para escritura creativa. Ha publicado 4 libros de poesía y también un libro de cuentos. Su trabajo literario ha sido difundido en periódicos y revistas en México y en el extranjero. Actualmente dirige Darklight Publishing, editorial que fundó en Nueva York en el 2016. Muchas gracias, Roberto, y Robert, adelante.
Buenas tardes. Agradezco a la Coordinación Nacional de Literatura de Bellas Artes, en especial a las maestras Leticia Luna e Itzia Pintado, que hicieron posible esta presentación editorial. Muchas gracias. Es un placer para mí presentar y conversar con el profesor Robert Kramer, autor del libro de poesía que tiene el título original en inglés In the Margins, en español al margen, publicado por la editorial Darklight con sede en Nueva York. Este libro en formato bilingüe es el 15º título de la colección Bridges de poesía, y he tenido el privilegio de traducirlo al español, privilegio tanto por la posibilidad de intercambiar impresiones de primera mano con su autor, así como por el hecho de que el profesor Kramer es él mismo traductor de poesía alemana antigua al inglés, lo que nos dio la oportunidad de resolver de manera conjunta algunas cuestiones técnicas que surgen en toda traducción. Doy la bienvenida a Robert Kramer, sostendremos una breve conversación y posteriormente nos leerá algunos de los poemas contenidos en este nuevo libro que hoy les presentamos, un libro que está magníficamente ilustrado por el artista estadounidense Bob Gibbons y que ya está disponible en línea para adquirirse y en algunas cadenas de librerías de la República Mexicana. Así que pues comenzamos con Mr. Robert Kramer. Buenas tardes, good afternoon.
Hi, good to be here.
Your book has many subjects, but as an attentive reader between the lines of your poems, some of them apparently very gentle perversity arises. I find your poetry is traversed by 2 great themes, sexuality and decomposition, but that's my reading.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other great themes that I have missed and you would like to mention?
I'm very much interested in the unconscious mind, the world of dreams, for example, irrationality. But also I'm very much interested in uncertainty the doubtful. So much of life, we skim along the surface as if it were certain and secure, and it's not. And as Heidegger said, the poet is a provocateur. He's a problem maker. So the poet will notice things, note things that ordinary people might not get. And he brings them to light. That can be disturbing, but it's also exciting and fulfilling.
Okay, thank you. I agree with you that the poet is a provocador, provocator. And okay, you are the author of many books, anthologies of all Germanic poetry that you have translated into English. As a translator, what is your point of view on the discussion about doing a literal translation as close as possible to the original, or creating whole new poems from the suggestions and layers of meanings of each work?
I think if we're going to call something a translation, then it should be as close as possible to the original experience of the reader in the native language. It should have the same degree of difficulty or clarity, same degree of humor or irony. It should obviously have the same basic images and ideas, but it should not necessarily have the same grammatical constructions, for example. It's very important to have the rhythm of the original poem, but it's less important to have the rhyme, unless you're translating somebody like Alexander Pope or Pushkin, where the snap of the rhyme at the end of the line is vital to its meaning. So as I said, my goal is to recreate the experience that I had in the original, say, German, and give the English reader the same experience in certain vital areas, such as rhythm, imagery.
Okay, thank you. You have devoted your life to literature and education, teaching at many universities throughout the United States, but you also serve your country as part of the US Army. Could you please talk to us briefly about your experience and how that impacts on your poetry?
First of all, I was blessed in a way by serving in the military between two wars, between Korea and Vietnam. So buddies of mine were killed in Korea and others were killed in Vietnam. I was spared. I was in the middle. I never served abroad. All of my time in the Army was with the Chemical Corps, working with poison gases and radiation in the United States. But my experience of Europe came as a Fulbright scholar, as a Swiss government scholar. I had research grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I lived over there. I took student tours over there. And I later became director of international studies at Manhattan College. So that was a vital part of my life, an exciting part of it. And eventually my daughter picked up on some of that, and she lived in Europe for a while too. So I love European culture, and yeah, that's enough.
Okay, thank you. And I know you read as much as possible in English and German. And I also know you have read the work of several Spanish and Latin American writers. Could you please mention some of them, your favorite authors of these three languages, English, German, and Spanish?
Well, I think the greatest American poet is Emily Dickinson, but I don't try and imitate her. She's got a unique style. And her use of rhyme, for example, that's not my project, but I admire her work tremendously. T.S. Eliot, I think, is one of the finest American poets, intelligent, sensitive, with a sense of humor and awareness of history, European and Asian culture. In the Spanish-speaking world, my hero is Borges. And he's such a great writer that I was happy to have met him several times and spoken with him. Wow. And I've written a couple of poems about him also. And I've become a big fan of the tango. I've gone to Buenos Aires, dance, watch, play the tangos. So, but he's primarily a great writer.
Okay.
And of course, in Spanish literature, I read in bilingual editions people like Calderón or Góngora, who I think are quite wonderful. Also. Can I say something bad? Can I say that I think Lorca is overrated? I think you have other poets who are greater. Okay, I'll stop.
Okay. No, and it's great that you admire the poets from the El Siglo de Oro, because that's linked with the work that in this book you write about the Rococo period, ancient periods, old periods, and that's nice that you admire those poets. Okay, thank you. In the margins is divided in 7 sections. You dedicate each one of them to a specific theme. I am naturally curious about the section Habsburg, where you depict a decaying 19th century atmosphere in Vienna. You know, in Mexico, we briefly had an Austrian emperor. Another section of your book rejoices on the Rococo period, as I said. Please tell us about your interest in those times of history and writing poetry on them. What's the motivation to write on those periods, about those periods?
Well, I happen to love Vienna almost as much as I love New York City. Those are my 2 favorites. And the incredible richness of Viennese culture, especially around the turn of the century, with the birth of modernism in music, in the visual arts, in literature, and in general. So that's one aspect of it. Unfortunately, the poems that are in the margins are negative images of the collapsing, decadent Austrian Empire. But I remember I had more than that would show other aspects of it. And then the Rococo, I never used to like the Rococo compared to other cultural eras, but I became fascinated by the veneer, by the wonderful phoniness of it, the hypocrisy, the role playing, which has much in common with our modern world, I think. So my Rococo poems in here are really veiled commentaries on our own hypocritical phony society. So.
The current society.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, thank you, thank you. There are many more questions that arise from your answers and from this book, of course, but now I think the time has come for you to read to the audience some of your poems. Thanks, Professor. And please read some of your poems.
Okay, I'd just like to say I divided it into these 7 sections to give some sense of form, that there might be developments and interrelations. And of course, 7 is a magic number of the 7 sacraments, the 7 deadly sins.
Okay. So there's also something symbolic.
Yeah.
Having chosen that number of chapters or sections.
Yeah, I mean, it's not vital, but it's, I like the idea of a certain form with meaning.
Okay, thank you.
The first section of this book is called From a Gallery of Introverts. So it's a collection of short character sketches, personalities with, let's say, a few images that will bring out something of the depths of that personality. Let me read the first poem in this collection, which is called Portrait Miniature, Beneath the Dragonfly. This is a portrait of a woman who is waiting, who has had a lover's quarrel, and she is waiting to see what will happen when her lover comes, if her lover comes. Beneath the Dragonfly. From the adjacent darkness, rain pelts the window pane. Beside that mirroring glass, a woman is reading, one beneath a lamp with a green shade. Upon this etched and amber lampshade, a blue dragonfly with fine-veined iridescent wings hovers above the woman, who is sitting quietly, awaiting a visitor, one with slender, elegant fingers. She would often watch very closely those two hands of his, as when they severed with a silver blade the mottled orange peel from its tender orange flesh to yield a single slender, graceful, curling helix, with admiration and a certain envy. But now she feels like that child in the winter twilight, returning alone from the distant village, walking cautiously through the forest and clutching her wicker basket, empty now. For not yet achieved after the lovers' quarrel, the comfort of avid copulation, as her thoughts advance through time, where she seems to see two white and trembling fingers hovering above a queen in a final row of a splendid chessboard, her own face still smudged with a lapsed smile. And let me read something else from these portrait miniatures here. This is called The Hunchback's Coat, another portrait of a woman who is not a hunchback at all. The Hunchback's Coat. Her life seems like those dim interiors in silent films, a table, chairs, the walls, and the light extends but little beyond the lamp, where most is doubtful flicker in the shadows, despite the yellow cab she often hails and the box of chocolates in her drawer. At times she dreams her timid dreams of happiness, like those pigtailed Slovak village children who furtively will touch the tip of the coat on the hunchback's bobbing back. Thus her solitary nocturnal walks, suffused with feelings of apprehension, for she lives in a world filled with messages, but all transmitted in a code unknown to her. And thus these winter days, she often has the feeling that she has missed something, perhaps that she has come but just a moment too late, or that there is something very meaningful close by, perhaps a flower shop on the very next street, or something just beyond the corner of her eye, even now. Amidst their casual chatter of enhancers, their latest toys and anal explorations, she sees in those about her, their smiling faces, the forced gaiety, the mirthless laughter, the formulaic expressions of affection, and on the threshold, those ostentatious, but quite coolly automatic kisses deposited on both awaiting cheeks. And she well knows that the unmentionable is everywhere on the very verge of being mentioned, and the way we repress, conceal our deepest feelings, the greatest yearnings, sharpest disappointments, darkest pain, just as we cover the ardent, swelling flesh of our bodies with useless, foolish fabrics, and make the mildest gestures, polite, discreet, with hands that long perhaps to grasp or push away, and how we speak with irony and would-be wit, or respond to outrage with an eyebrow slightly raised, instead of violent grimace, shout, or shriek. Suddenly and inexplicably, she recalls a child, a whirling child, like a spinning top with billowing skirt and outstretched arms and eyes closed tight. A child who long ago would play with vertigo and downfall. It startles like the echo of a cough in an empty cathedral. The next section is called This Is What My Father Told Me. And here, each poem represents a memory of a father telling a certain story, memories from his childhood. I haven't read this one a long time. Let me read New Boy in the Neighborhood, which is probably an experience that many young people have had, moving into a neighborhood that's totally unfamiliar, trying to fit in, trying to become a member of the childhood community there. New Boy in the Neighborhood. His first day in the new school, he enters late the classroom. The eyes of the other children fasten on him as he stands hesitant and anxious on the threshold. Feeling his face grow warm beneath the teacher's expectant gaze, he looks off, distracted, at the blackboard, where he sees written in chalk a string of numbers, symbols, meaningless, the silence broken now by mocking laughter. Later, the new boy in the neighborhood walks the streets, observing the various bands of neighborhood children, tentatively seeking to join the others, to join the play of the others. They, with their easy familiarity, their clearly established hierarchy, their smug disdain for the outsider, awkward and unknowing, he tries to please, to become a part, with the brim of his cap pulled down close over his eyes. Expressionless, he slouches and scuffs the black-tarred street with his ragged canvas sneakers, his left hand enclosed and hidden in a massive tattered first baseman's mitt. He pounds his bare right fist into its warm and oily palm and eyes the others expectantly. At home, alone in the darkened room, he sits before the massive ancient radio, as if before an altar, as it sheds a greenish glow from its dial. Very slowly, he rotates the fluted knob, evoking hums and whistles, crackling sounds, or voices soft or loud or very faint, voices in foreign languages, the didas of Morse code, and calls from ships far out at sea, perhaps in storm, in need. And very carefully he turns and finds new voices in the finest interstices, changing pitches, lowering the whistle, dulling the hum, and intercepting with countless unknown worlds, sensing for briefest moments, mingling solitudes. And another one from this section. By the way, I'd like to point out that this is a father speaking. So we're way back in the past. There are little elements that make it clear that these are scenes from the early 19th century, early 20th century, perhaps. I like to put my characters in their historical context. This one is called Losers. 1. In those long past smoky autumn days, we boys would race to the woods, to the tallest trees, to see who could climb the highest, fastest. Beneath the big squirrel nests high above us, with acorns dropping on our shoulders as the squirrels themselves darted ever higher, with our legs clasped tight around the tree trunks, as not much later the tightened thighs of long-haired girls would tighten around our adolescent bodies. Over the rough bark we clambered ever upward, less agile than the squirrels, but laughing, jeering, as the crows screamed with reprimands. Or in winter, we would gather at the frozen pond, the steep glacial depression in the woods, rimmed like a soup bowl and ringed with crackling fires, where girls and boys in brightest sweaters would skate and sport on the ragged ice, avoiding the driftwood that protruded from the surface like the clawing hands of drowned hobos. 2. Yet sometimes we think of the losers in our class, such complacence in that word, from our early years of school, who seemed to vanish from our world, soon after graduation's caps and gowns. long forgotten, now suddenly returning, faces from the most distant corridors of the mind, the girl with a bent and massive nose, the boy who slobbered when he spoke, the pallid girl who smelled, who found one day upon her desk at school an insinuating bar of strong brown soap, and the boy who simply could not grasp or learn. From days at school where we, the privileged, would sit quite unperturbed, quite unaware of their still hidden inner anguish. And then much later in our lives, we would hear or read of one or the other, like the dentist's daughter with the bulging eyes, who alone in her West Side apartment slashed her slender wrists, or the slow-witted silent boy lost in the war. Those losers, those lost. I'd like to read one poem from this Rococo section, which is supposed to be a bit of a reflection on the artificiality and hypocrisy of our time. In the last years of the Sun King, like muffled voices and faces behind curtains, their daily rituals, their courtships filled with rites and gestures codified, prescribed, certain movements of the fan, a turn or tilt of the head, words delivered with a particular inflection, all with their special meanings, at times displayed with a flourish, or hidden at times beneath a cloak of seeming spontaneity. Or one will confide in you with tilted head and arching eyebrow and a meaningful look. And though you recognize the insinuating body comments on her just now spoken words, their urgency, at times you do not comprehend, and the scattered words will float disjointed, free in space about her archly smiling face. A painter of alcoves and boudoirs might well capture, with an air of exquisite nonchalance and vaporousness, the tilt of her head, the glint of white highlight on the moistened lower lip, the flutter of the hand. But he would not catch the pauses and solicitous hesitations in conversations most polite, the veiled allusions and evasions of those connoisseurs of subtle gestures and the fleeting glimpse, who communicate in whispered confidences, sentences unfinished, and exclamations, and at times, as an insect would examine an unfamiliar object with the tips of its quivering antennae, in a place where every word is studied and every emotion feigned, with desperate duplicity amidst the murk of rumor and suspicion. And yet, after a certain infelicitous expression intended to capture a fleeting moment of delight, she sits in the half-light on the far side of the room with face averted.
Muchas gracias a Roberto Kramer por su precisa sensibilidad que a través del libro In the Margins nos lleva al margen de la palabra poética, y también a Roberto Mendoza Ayala por traernos esta traducción que puede revisarse en ambos idiomas. Por supuesto, gracias a ustedes que nos permiten su atención. El Centro de Creación Literaria Javier Villaurrutia, sede de la Coordinación Nacional de Literatura de Bellas Artes, junto con la Secretaría de Cultura y el Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes y Literatura, les agradece su presencia.
Gobierno de México.